There are kings remembered for wars, emperors remembered for conquest, and rulers feared for the destruction they caused across nations. But history hides one man whose power worked in a completely different way. He didn't destroy cities with armies or collapse governments through invasion. Instead, his wealth alone became so overwhelming that entire economies struggled to handle it. Imagine being so rich that simply visiting another country changes the value of money itself. That was the reality of Mansa Musa, the ruler of the Mali Empire, and the man many historians consider the richest human being to ever live. His fortune was so massive that even today, experts cannot accurately calculate it. Some say he was worth hundreds of billions. Others believe numbers themselves fail to measure the scale of his wealth. But what truly transformed him into legend was not just the gold he owned, but the journey that carried his riches across the world and left entire nations stunned in disbelief. In the early 14th century, long before modern banks, stock markets, or billion-dollar corporations existed, the world operated through trade routes stretching across deserts and oceans. Kingdoms rose because of resources, and among all resources on Earth, none carried greater power than gold. It symbolized wealth, stability, and authority. Whoever controlled gold controlled influence. Deep within West Africa stood an empire overflowing with this precious metal, hidden from much of the outside world, yet richer than many nations combined. At the center of that empire ruled Mansa Musa, a king whose name would eventually spread from Africa to the Middle East and Europe through whispers of impossible riches. Travelers spoke about golden caravans crossing endless deserts. Merchants described cities overflowing with wealth, and mapmakers began illustrating a mysterious African ruler holding gold in his hand, like the treasure of the world itself. What began as one ruler's sacred journey soon became one of the most unbelievable economic stories in human history. During the 1300s, much of Europe faced instability, disease, poverty, and endless conflict while kingdoms fought constantly for land and survival. Yet far beyond Europe, across the Sahara Desert, another civilization thrived in extraordinary prosperity. The Mali Empire stretched across huge regions of West Africa, covering territories that today include Mali, Senegal, Guinea, Niger, and surrounding areas. It became one of the largest and most powerful empires of its era, built not only on military strength, but on control over trade itself. At the heart of Mali's success stood gold, as the empire controlled nearly half of the world's known gold supply, making it one of the richest places on Earth. Every major trade route moving through Africa carried goods connected to Mali's economy. Gold traveled north into the Middle East and Europe, while salt, textiles, books, and luxury goods moved back through the empire. Wealth flowed constantly across the desert like rivers of commerce, and cities inside Mali flourished with activity as merchants, scholars, travelers, and traders gathered in markets bursting with opportunity. This was not a forgotten land hidden from civilization, but one of the economic centers of the medieval world. At the center of this golden empire stood Mansa Musa. Unlike ordinary kings who merely collected taxes, Musa controlled the very source of the wealth itself. He owned lands filled with gold mines that produced unimaginable riches year after year. Modern historians have attempted to calculate his fortune using today's financial systems, but many admit the task is nearly impossible. Some estimates place his wealth above $400 billion in modern value, potentially making him richer than any billionaire alive today. But even those numbers may fail to capture reality because Musa's fortune wasn't limited to stored money or treasure. His power came from direct ownership of the resources generating global wealth, and entire economies depended on the gold coming from his empire. To many people across the world, Mali became synonymous with endless riches, and its ruler appeared almost mythical in scale. Yet despite all this wealth, Mansa Musa wanted more than luxury. He wanted greatness that would outlive him, and soon one journey would make his name echo across history forever. Mansa Musa became ruler of Mali around the year 1312 under mysterious circumstances, when the previous ruler disappeared during an expedition into the Atlantic Ocean and never returned. With the throne suddenly, his Musa inherited one of the richest empires on Earth. But unlike many rulers obsessed only with conquest and power, he envisioned something larger for Mali's future. He wanted the empire to become not just wealthy, but respected as a center of culture, faith, scholarship, and influence. Under his rule, cities expanded rapidly while trade routes became safer and more organized. He funded construction projects, built magnificent mosques, supported scholars, and encouraged education across the empire. Timbuktu slowly transformed into a growing center of learning, where knowledge attracted visitors from distant lands. Musa understood that wealth alone could not guarantee immortality because gold could disappear, armies could fall, and empires could collapse, but ideas, faith, and knowledge could survive for generations. That vision separated him from many rulers of his time as Mali became prosperous, organized and filled with opportunity, yet the event that would define his legacy was still ahead. In 1324, Mansa Musa prepared for the most important journey of his life, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca required in Islam. But for Musa, nothing could ever be ordinary. And what should have been a spiritual expedition soon transformed into one of the greatest displays of wealth the medieval world had ever witnessed. When the massive caravan departed from Mali, it looked less like a royal trip and more like an empire moving across the desert. Tens of thousands of people traveled together, including soldiers, officials, servants, scholars, merchants, guards, and attendants, stretching across the Sahara in an endless moving line. Witnesses described slaves dressed in silk, carrying staffs made of pure gold, while musicians and royal escorts accompanied the king. Dozens upon dozens of camels carried bags of gold dust so heavy that the caravan glittered under the desert sun, and villages stopped to watch this unimaginable procession move through the Sahara like a living symbol of wealth. Musa was not traveling to intimidate the world, and historical accounts suggest he remained generous throughout the journey, donating gold freely to the poor and supporting communities along the route. But this generosity would soon create consequences nobody could have predicted, as rumors spread ahead of him about an African king richer than entire nations. When he finally entered Cairo, the city was left in disbelief because Egypt had seen powerful rulers before, but nothing on this scale. Markets became flooded with activity as Musa distributed gold, rewarded officials, purchased luxury goods, and supported charities. And for a moment the city experienced sudden prosperity. However, beneath the excitement, a dangerous economic shift began as gold lost its rarity and therefore its value. Prices changed, currency stability weakened, and inflation spread across the economy because too much wealth had entered circulation too quickly. Today, economists call this inflation, where too much money reduces value, and in the 1300s there were no systems to control such an event. Historical accounts suggest the effects lasted for years, with some believing Egypt's economy remained unstable long after Musa's visit. The most astonishing part is that he never intended harm, acting instead from generosity and religious devotion. Yet his fortune was so enormous that ordinary economic systems could not handle it. Stories even suggest he later tried to stabilize the situation by borrowing gold back on his return journey, showing how extreme the impact had become. His pilgrimage became one of history's greatest examples of how wealth alone can reshape entire economies without a single act of violence. Long after he left Egypt, stories of his wealth spread across continents as traders, scholars, and mapmakers described the African ruler whose riches seemed beyond reality. Mali suddenly became known across the world, and even medieval maps depicted Mansa Musa holding gold, symbolizing unimaginable wealth. This attention reshaped global perception of West Africa and inspired fascination with its trade routes. But Musa's greatest legacy was not just wealth or fame, it was what he built after returning home. He invested heavily in education, architecture, and scholarship, transforming Timbuktu into one of the most important centers of learning in the medieval world. Libraries filled with manuscripts on science, mathematics, law, and religion flourished, attracting scholars from across continents and turning the city into a beacon of knowledge. After his death, however, the Mali Empire slowly began to decline as trade routes shifted. Internal conflicts grew, and external pressures increased. Cities lost influence, wealth decreased, and over time, the empire faded into history. Manuscripts were lost, cities weakened, and political power fragmented, yet the legend of Mansa Musa survived. He is remembered not for war or conquest, but for wealth so vast that it changed economies, and stunned civilizations. His story remains one of the most extraordinary examples in history of financial power, showing that sometimes the greatest force in the world is not an army, but unimaginable abundance itself.